Hello, good evening. This is Vinita Shetty, convener of Placemaking India, and you're tuned into Urban Jam, which is a collective online learning platform for the Indic placemaking diaspora, we call it. More than 500 children die in road crashes globally. So goes a statistic from the US National Association of City Transportation Officials. Making a city that works for children evokes images of traffic wardens steering school children across zebra crossings. But there is much, much more to making the urban environment safe, healthy, and beneficial for children. In fact, when you make a city that works for children, you're actually creating a city that works for residents of all ages and ability. So, whether that involves designing in green infrastructure for their vulnerable respiratory system, or designing medans which encourage playful learning, these have benefits for adults as well. Well-being, resilience, emotional health are also outcomes shaped by the environment of one's early years and also by the primary caregivers of children. And cities do have it in their control to help or hinder a human being's development through the choices they make in infrastructure and resources. So, here to discuss the ways and means based on best practice that she has keenly observed around the world is Ankita Chachra, who leads the Street Kids program as the Senior Program Manager at Global Designing Cities Initiative for the NATCO. So she's linking into us from New York City. The Urban Vision and GDCI have worked together on pedestrianization projects in Mumbai. So it is fitting that Aditi Nargundkar Pathak, who is head of placemaking in the Urban Vision in Mumbai, is moderating this discussion. I'll briefly introduce Aditi, who in turn will introduce Ankita. So Aditi is an urban designer and has been running the placemaking program, enabling the use of public art in plazas and designing human-centric cities and innovative plazas in Indian cities. She has led and completed multiple demonstration projects, creating small social spaces which have changed the safety, aesthetics, and use of the city's public spaces. She's also a visiting faculty in various colleges of architecture and urban planning in Mumbai. Now, before I turn over to Aditi, can I please request that everybody turn off their audio? If you could please turn off your audio, because there's some disturbance. I can hear some sounds besides my own. Thank you. Thank you so much. Aditi, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Vinita, for this very brief and very succinct introduction. I have not personally worked with Ankita, but I know the work that their group is doing, and it's quite commendable. They have been working a lot in all over globally on designing the streets and using best practices to design the streets. About Ankita, as I know, she joined NACTO's Global Designing Cities initiative in 2015 and helped with writing and production of the Global Street Design Guide. As a senior program manager, she leads the Streets for Kids program, which recently published the Designing Streets for Kids Guide. In her current work, she applies tools and strategies from NACTO's design guides to address street and public space design challenges faced by cities. She is committed to creating safe, healthy, and humane cities and that prioritize the needs of young children and their caregivers. Prior to joining NACTO, Ankita has worked as an urban designer for planning studios of Skidmore, Owing, and Merrill in San Francisco, where she primarily contributed towards mixed-use planning and transit-oriented urban projects. Her work experience varies greatly from detailed architectural design projects to large-scale planning efforts throughout India, China, Malaysia, and United States. I'm very excited actually to have a chat with Ankita because this is a very, suddenly it has become a very close to my heart kind of a project because I have a 2-year-old and I know how hard it is for me as a young mother to take her to a simple park. And I can't even imagine letting her walk alone on the streets of Mumbai. So I'm really looking forward to Ankita's talk. I mean, at a professional and a very personal level. So over to you, Ankita.
Thank you, Aditi, and thank you, Vinita. I'm going to quickly share my screen and get started there. So thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to present my work and the work that we've been doing. As Aditi mentioned, I work with NACTO's Global Designing Cities Initiative. And for those of you who are not familiar with our work, I do encourage you to check out our websites. You'll see that not only there are some amazing visual guidance that's there, but also a lot of the cities that we've been working with. And globally, we obviously work, from cities from Mumbai to this project in Istanbul that's right behind me, to Sao Paulo, Bogota, Fortaleza. And we're adding more to the list as we are expanding. But when we work with cities, the way we really approach our work is through the lens of streets. And that's where I want to start. And I think, a handful of us feel that streets are for mobility. But what we don't recognize is that streets are our largest network of continuous public space in any city. They're actually the biggest asset that we have in the city. And when I say public space, it means that it is public's space. And I think what's really interesting is in context of Indian cities, growing up in Delhi and kind of looking at also old pictures of what streets were. I think that Indian cities at this moment are actually at a dichotomy of what's public space and what's given to automobiles. You can see different activities, whether it's markets or children playing cricket on the street, which is very common, or people doing business like here, selling vegetables. To at the same time, we also have another reality where you see cars really overtaking our streets, and there's basically this fight of who owns the street. And like the aspect of this dependence on cars that the cities are encouraging, and even in terms of national policy, you can see how car use is incentivized. What that does is that it really fails everyone else. And I think, Aditi, like the point you raised, having a two-year-old or having young kids, I think what it does is it tells us that the street doesn't belong to us. It's not our space. And I think that's a very that situation itself is not something that we want from cities that have had this rich history and have had like this vibrancy. So the fact is that this result of failing our citizens, failing children, failing caregivers, failing women, or even failing people that have limited mobility, is not just evident in the experience that you have when you're on the street. It's also starting to show in the numbers that the world is watching. And if you look at the road safety stats, 17 people die on Indian streets every hour. And this number 17 can be you can dissociate with it, but when you think of someone's brother, sister, friend, it becomes even more painful to think of. And then it's not just about traffic crashes. I think like we've seen that Indian cities have been highly polluted. A lot of the air quality and like the conversations around air quality, its effect on children, knowing that transportation sector is one of the biggest, contributor to this. So the fact is that we're creating cities, and this is not by accident. We're doing this by design. We are incentivizing, we are prioritizing certain modes, which have resulted in these conditions. This is a planning problem as much as it is a policy problem or a cultural problem. So, one of the things that I've been focusing on recently is children. And the question is, well, why are you talking about children when we are talking about planning? And I'll start with the one simple thing. For all of those who do have children in their lives, whether they're their own or their cousins or their nieces or their nephews, or their grandchildren, I think one of the things that we see with children is this promise of future. As human beings, we are meant to continue our legacy through our children. And the future of our generation is children. And the truth is that the future of cities that we are designing will inherently affect or shape the future of our children. So all these decisions that we are making today have a future implication to it. And then there's a more interesting aspect to me when it comes to children. I think what's really interesting is new studies that are really talking about how children want to explore, and the fact that their brains are making 1 million connections per second. So every moment in a child's life, especially when you're looking from 0 to 3, they're experiencing something new. They're seeing a butterfly for the first time. They're taking their first step. They're doing a lot of things that we have become used to doing, right? Like we can hold something, we can grab onto something, but for them, that's their first experience. And instead of letting these experiences be heightened and be in a condition where they can thrive, because of our love and protection for them, what we're really doing is we're containing our kids. They're really bound. And I think COVID-19 with the lockdown was one of the biggest eye-opening aspect for a lot of countries, for a lot of cities, where children were just contained. They weren't even allowed to go outside to play, to interact with nature. And while during the corona time, we've seen this because of just this lockdown that's been placed on cities. I think that was true even before, and it will be true if we don't change our actions now, because I think a part of it is that we've created environments where car is the king. We've really created cities where most of the space on the street is given to cars. That's what's prioritized. And then maybe when there's space, we allow a few buses and a few cyclists. They're considered to be a nuisance in a lot of cities. And then pedestrians are often forgotten. So, I mean, when you come down to children, like they're so small and in their height and the way they navigate that space that no one even thinks about them. So in order to change this narrative, we need to change what we are prioritizing and start by prioritizing people, children, caregivers, public space, which is our streets, and having that interaction on their streets, to then followed by sustainable modes of transportation like bus and transit or cycling. Because, I mean, we're talking about people being able to move from one place to another in cities, and we cannot do this if we just keep building for cars. There's just not enough space in our cities for that. And then make sure that we have these amenities and services, and if there's space, allow private vehicles. And by that, really doing that, we can start to make children more visible in the city, where you can actually have those social interactions, where children can actually play on the street as they used to, and they still do when they find those little respite in a very busy city, to be able to bike to school and really start to have conversation with their caregivers and experience the city in a different way, to the point of just being able to just run around freely with what they were meant to do, to explore their built environment. So really thinking of how those connections, I talked about the million connections, those connections can be between two children, it could be between their caregiver and children, it could be within the built environment. It is everywhere. I think the possibility there is unlimited. And the fact that we can do this, I think the most simple way of doing it is to just understand that we do have this space in our cities. We just need to reclaim it, and make sure that we're instead of providing space for cars and just thinking of like one user, how do we make sure that people can spend more time on their streets? They have space to sit, they have space to talk, they have the space to enjoy their children playing in that in this public space. And the fact is that our work shows that the cities have been doing it. This is an image from Fortaleza. This is what it was before to what it is after. And this was just paint. It was done in a matter of few days. It's about just having the will to go ahead and do it. Similarly in Mumbai, this was our first project in Mumbai, and you can see how much space can be reclaimed even in the streets of Mumbai. And I think there are other projects like, and other partners like ITTP, there's, Urban Vision, and so many other organizations, WRI, that are doing very similar work. I recently got an image from Karol Bagh that was pedestrianized. So there are cities, and even Udaipur and Jaipur, there are cities that are doing that, and it's a great first step. So from there, I mean, one of the other things that I do want to take a moment here and talk about in the next 5 to 10 minutes that I have is, we're doing this, we're reclaiming space for pedestrians. But when you start thinking of children, what are we really trying to say here? And there are two aspects from the streets that we can expect. One is improving mobility and making sure that there's space for independent mobility. Aditi, you talked about not, feeling so scared to have your 2-year-old toddler even run on the street. And there's this level of independence that I think most parents would be worried about. But I think that that's the first aspect of understanding our streets. And the second one is making sure that it's not just about mobility, but it is also about places to pause, sit, and play, to really utilize that public space. So how do we really do that? And I think the way we look at it is three categories. The first and the most basic one is to make sure that we have safe and healthy environments for children, making sure that streets are safe, comfortable and convenient, and inspiring and educational. And what that means is when we're talking about safe and accessible, it means that we're making sure that children can get from one place to the other safely. They're not in harm's way. We're not worried about traffic fatalities. We're not worried about personal security. There is that very safe infrastructure that exists. The second, when I talk about comfortable and enjoyable, and I think this picture is from Bogota, but I think this is true in a lot of Indian cities where curbs and sidewalks are so tall that you can't even get on top of it. So you have obviously people not walking on the footpath, which then becomes this argument that no one uses the footpath well, it's not well designed. So identifying where small changes, small details can have a really big impact. And then finally thinking of how do we make sure that children who are absorbing so much information from their environment are able to learn and have joy and joyful spaces within the street, which means that making sure that everyday spaces are places where they can learn, where they can take risks, where they can play, and that doesn't take much. Sometimes it's a very small change, because I think children's imaginations are so beautiful and so big that sometimes as adults we don't even recognize what might just become a very playful and a joyful thing for them. So from there, and the guidance that is available, which I encourage you to go and check out online, it will be available for as a free PDF starting mid-August. So there's all this information there, but there we start to really identify, like if you're looking at a street, how do you look at the sidewalk? How wide does it have to be? Can we add lighting? Can we make sure that crosswalks are marked? Can we add ramps? To thinking of the safe, to thinking of comfort, where it starts about like adding benches. Something as simple as having a space to sit can make a huge difference if you're navigating a space with a little child and you're carrying them. Sometimes they're hungry, sometimes they want to cry, sometimes they just want to pause. To then making sure that the way we're thinking of textures, we're thinking of that educational aspect is also considered. So from pedestrian experience to thinking from the cyclist experience, to also thinking of the transit experience. And I know that Indian cities have a long way to go when it comes to transit, but it again comes back to investing and making sure that we are prioritizing that aspect of design. So just to sum it up, there are multiple actions that we can take in order to make cities that can allow for children and caregivers to pause and play, from different, and again, these vary from which sector you're in and what you have control over. But I do want to say that the first one that starts with for me is to make sure that we're able to disincentivize private vehicles. And I know there's this love for cars, there's a status symbol that's attached. Even in my own family, I have my brother and my parents that do really love their cars, and they know that this is their only way to get around. But that's because we haven't provided people enough options. We haven't made sustainable transportation safe, convenient, or affordable, or comfortable, that connects from one place to the other. So it's time that as cities, as we're thinking of it, thinking from just from the policy level to the infrastructural decisions to the design decisions, that we are always thinking of those that are not in the automobile. And pedestrian infrastructure often comes in forms of, I would say, pedestrian bridges that don't necessarily work. So we have to stop thinking that it's the pedestrian bridge that's pedestrian infrastructure and we've checked a box. So really thinking like from the perspective of a comfort, because for children and those on a wheelchair or those with a stroller, they're not going to go up a pedestrian bridge. And then once we do that, I think all these other actions come naturally. So we can actually slow down vehicles by design because we're prioritizing pedestrian safety over speed. We can start to think of how do we improve pedestrian crossings where children are visible, to the fact that, you know, that we're expecting cars to stop at pedestrian crossings. We're encouraging that culture. I know a while back there were some advertisements in Indian media which kind of talked about this pedestrian right, and I think we need to do more of that. Um, Making sure that we're not neglecting trees and green spaces. It's not just about parks. We need trees and green spaces in every aspect, every street. They also have other benefits from cleaning the air, which I think is a big problem with a lot of big streets in India. And then finally making sure that we can reclaim spaces for play and learning. And again, this comes in a variation. There are different shapes and sizes to it, from places to pause and, you know, just take 1 minute's breath when, you know, you want to just listen to your child and understand what's happening, to places to sit where you can actually feed or take care of your kid, or maybe even read a book to them, to places of staying where they can actually play and you know, be in the built environment and build those connections. So my last few ways of wrapping this up is, as we're thinking of cities and as we're thinking of placemaking, we really need to think of kids, because cities that work for children, they work for everyone else, and I can't say that enough. So think kids, not cars, and making sure that you know, that we're creating activities that invite children to play and be themselves. This image is very close to my heart because you know, 5 hours before this plaza was created, it was actually just an asphalt, and children in that neighborhood had no place to go. They had no parks, and I remember one of the parents coming up to us and saying that this is amazing. I've never seen my child play on the street, and here he is just having fun on the street. I've never seen that, and I think that to me spoke a lot, because I think we often forget this need for playing that children have. So the fact is, children do grow up fast, so we need to act now. We have the toolkit, whether it's tactical urbanism, whether it is any kind of action that we can take on, from just, you know, adding a sidewalk to adding a crossing to reclaiming a plaza like this one behind me, and remembering that, you know, we need to let children be children, and let them use the space that they have. And as a result, it's also good because sometimes adults can also become children. And this picture is of my husband. We were in Amsterdam and there was a trampoline and he couldn't help himself play. So I think that it does have an added benefit for adults too, as we're thinking of designing for children. And with that, I will stop and open this up for discussion for everyone. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ankita. This was like a really wonderful presentation, I must say. And I loved your line, think children, not cars, which is really so important right now. Which we honestly, in Urban Vision, we have been working a lot in, you know, pedestrianizing the streets and making the pedestrians a priority, and, you know, using tactical urbanism, using urbanism, landscape, also art. We've been doing a lot of that work. But, you know, the challenge so far for us has been that especially the tactical urbanism, when you need someone from the community to come and take the ownership of those spaces, correct? Now, the beautiful thing of, the positive thing of COVID-19 that I am observing is that, you know, in India, for the first time, there are these social networks that are being formed, which are like maybe WhatsApp groups or online groups, where, you know, the communities have leaders already, which are, you know, taking the lead in maybe taking the temperatures, or, you know, putting the hand sanitizers near your society or something like that. So this has never happened before. So we right now have like this, you know, community leaders that are like coming up everywhere, like be it every community, right? Like be it slums or be it high rises. And I really feel that this is like a great opportunity to, you know, really for us as urbanists to create this change, wherein we can, you know, tap into that resource that is already being developed, wherein the people are already so, you know, sensitive, and they are now not really expecting the government to do everything for them, but actually take matters in their own hands. So that's like a habit that is already forming. And it's going to be like a great thing to use tactical urbanism, and maybe put some sort of what do we call that, leaders who can actually take care of those spaces. So what would your advice be for a country like India? What would be the 10 points that you think, or 5 points or 3 points, whatever you feel, would it be that, which would really bring in the change for us as a country, like, which, us, right? You are a part of us, so culturally how we are.
Yes.
So what do you think it's doable for us, really, within the community?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you raise, Aditi, and I agree with you. I think that I think the challenge in India is that we are and like I can be critical because I am from there, so please take this with a grain of salt. But I do think that the challenge, a part of it, is that there's dysfunction at both levels, the top down and the ground up. But I do think that, to your point, that from the ground up level, we can really organize very easily because we have very strong communities. I think that coronavirus and the whole COVID testing and RWA is becoming like this spearheading of like pretty much becoming a top down from a very low, you know what I mean? Like from neighborhood level, you have these RWAs. But I do think that a part of it is how do we switch that mindset in communities, and I think that challenge is a hard one to do, because I feel that, again, I know that Nidhi had presented last week about not representation of women. We need more women and children and advocates for children to be representative in these local communities. I think that the challenge is that if you're only thinking where you have the truth is that planning everywhere has been dictated by men in the past. And I think, and there is this obsession with cars, right? Like, as men and cars kind of, for me, come together. And I'm sorry for all the men in this call, but I do hope that you can be allies as we talk about children and we talk about women in public space. So I do think that there is definitely a lot of potential in organizing. I also think that the other aspect, like especially for Indian cities that are so big, like when you look at ward level or district level, and I've seen that happen even in bigger cities like Sao Paulo and Istanbul where I've worked, that the most success, instead of going from the central agency, like going from like central Mumbai, versus if you go from a ward or a district where the local engineers and the local planners actually have more, they're more in tune with the realities. So I think actually leading change from that level can be really effective, and it can be really fast, because a lot of times local districts have that capacity to design and work at that scale. So I would say that that's definitely one step further that we can start to take is at that local level.
Correct. I would right now like to just open up to the audiences if they have any questions. Do we have anyone who has any questions? Otherwise I can continue, no worries.
Hi, Ankita, and Aditi. Hi, I'm Pavitra Sriram speaking. Hi. So it was a wonderful presentation. I think I'm in love with all the graphics that you've shown and what you presented. By and large, I think it might not end up being a question, but largely I think I wanted to know what are your experiences from working with cities all over the globe, where when you take an agenda of children first, how do governments or say agencies react to a proposal like that? Like, so today, like there are conversations on gender first, there are conversations on children first, there are conversations about complete streets. But I mean, in my opinion, I think a complete street should be able to be inclusive for children, for women, for all types and kinds of people by and large. So what are the challenges you face when you work with different cities?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Pavitra, because I feel that what you said is absolutely correct. I think the moment we shift and we start talking about complete streets, I think the goals for all of these are the same. We want places that are livable, and we want people to have the space that they need and live healthy and safe lives. But what's interesting is when we do work with cities, we've had to kind of speak the language of the politician and the political will. So often we have to wear different hats and kind of package the same thing in a different wrapper, right? So if you have in some cases, you might find a mayor or a politician that is really pro, is an advocate for road safety. So we have obviously wrapped it around this, this language of how road safety wise this makes complete sense. You have some politicians, or you have some high official leaders that are very environmentally kind of inclined. So that's where we wrap it up around like how this has benefits for the environment, like the air is cleaner, and here it is. And a lot of times it actually comes down to economy and money. So I think in Indian cities too, one of the biggest things, I mean, when I started this work and we would like talk about all these amazing street designs, I would sit down and think to myself, why would someone in India care about this when there are people that are hungry, where you have like all these other issues that, like there's this blind, like we're blindsided with this idea of economic growth. So I think in the end, it really becomes of how we really package it and how we sell it, right? And I think what's interesting to me is if you look at the history of how automobiles and how consumerism has risen all over the world, they've been very organized, and they've told the stories that people want to hear. There's this idea of, oh, you can buy this car and there's never going to be any traffic on the street, and your life is fulfilled, and this is your life's goal and dream, right? Like they've sold this dream to people. And I think us as advocates for public space, advocates for equality in terms of how our space is treated, I think a part of our role is also now, I think, to really sell that dream and sell what is being bought. So if someone says that, hey, I actually just think it's about gender first, well, sure, gender first, but actually that also has benefits for children, it has benefits for the environment. It's how you frame it. So I do think that a part of me feels that it's how we frame our argument, because in the end, the solutions are the same.
Right. Actually, I would like to add to this. The thing about the current situation that we are in right now with COVID-19 and the social distancing norms that are going on, I think this is also going to be the packaging that Ankita has been talking about. We really need to understand that now, especially in India, our whole dialogue is changing a little bit. Economy, we understand, is very important, but right now we are seeing that, okay, if the economy stops for 4 months, people are still surviving. It's all right. And I mean, I know there are certain sections of the society who are suffering a lot more, but at the end of the day, you have to understand the percentage of what is happening and how many people are able to live without certain amenities like cars and buses, and I mean, not the buses, but without the cars, how many people are actually able to work from home, and how is it going to change our landscape? You know what I mean? So when you are actually talking to the government now, I feel it's going to be changing a little bit, because along with the economy, I think the social impact of what you're proposing is going to be equally important. And people, I think, are starting to understand that, and people are starting to talk about it, which is going to be very, very helpful. And I think this is also why the reason for this is also that the communities are getting very strong, because we are staying at home, which is very counterintuitive, but it is actually happening. So it's amazing to see this. The other actually, one of the things that I wanted to talk about to you, Ankita, is that places like Chicago, I've been reading about what we were going to talk, right? So places like Chicago are actually right now converting their streets into slow streets or public spaces, asking the restaurants to open the restaurant on the streets for maintaining the social distancing. So now, if that is to be the the new norm, how do we really fit in the kids' priorities in this kind of a scenario? What do you think about it? Like, if we are now going to give spaces, our streets, to the commercial establishments, how do we then take care of our social needs? Of, even though we are going to try and maintain the social distancing, but how do we take care of our social needs of going out for a jog or a park or something like that? How do you think that will happen?
Yeah, I think I don't think one is necessarily separate from the other. I think that when we talk about social connections and connection with the environment, the more people we have on the street, I think the more opportunities for those social connections, for those unintended encounters with people, for us to have build familiarity within our neighborhoods, because you're probably going to you're seeing the same people over and over again as you use those streets. But I do think that it is a matter of priorities. And I think what happens is often there's this conversation on whether, like we just don't have enough space. We can't put commercial, we can't put businesses, we can't put bike lanes and buses and cars and all of these things in the same space. But I think it's a matter of priority. It's like, who are you prioritizing on the street? Especially streets that are within the neighborhood can definitely be spaces where people can walk and bike. And I think that there is enough space in a lot of places for that. And I think it's about how we really start to design them. I think what's also interesting that you raised this question of shared streets in Chicago and actually everywhere in the US. I think there's this sudden embracement of wanting to embrace shared streets. And I think that reality existed in Indian streets. I think our streets de facto, wherever we haven't kind of bulldozed to build flyovers and really multi-lane highways, the reality is that we have shared streets. It's more about how do we make sure that now with automobiles and increase in this car ownership, that we reduce the speeds on those streets so they can continue to serve as shared streets, as de facto shared streets as they have, and still be safe for everyone to be in that environment. So I do think that idea of shared streets has always existed. It's about how do we really start to almost like, organize it a little bit. I think that it is already, like how do we have an organized chaos that already is, I think, existing in Indian streets. So I do think that we have that. It's just about where are you looking and which parts of the city do we need to really start to change those priorities. And that's why I talked about that dichotomy of streets, right? We have this amazing life that exists in a lot of places, but we also have one that is very hard. And I think the biggest challenge in Indian cities is how do you get from one place to the other if you're not driving, if you're taking transit, if you're trying to bike, God bless you. There are people who do bike and have biked forever, but they're not by any means have any infrastructure given to them. So how do you really get from place A to B without owning a private vehicle is the question. And I think once we start to look at it from that lens, while prioritizing all these other modes, I think that there's going to be space for all users to exist as long as we keep prioritizing the right mode.
Great. Thank you. Is there any other question from anyone in the audience?
Question. Yeah. Hi, Ankita. I really agree with your point that India has shared streets, but it's just very different to the developed world because of the circumstances and the very different kinds of public spaces that are present in India. But I just feel comparing Indian streets or making them similar to American streets would be very difficult, and I don't think that would be very wise because the footpaths are not laid very well, as you said, and there are food carts and there are vegetable vendors everywhere, and also people don't really walk everywhere. People use transport for everything, and so to achieve that level of public space that you mentioned in your photos and in your presentation would take a very long time. And how much time do you think we can anticipate for India to actually make at least our footpaths workable or to make it usable and to have a sense of place in the public spaces of India? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that we should be comparing Indian streets to American streets or any other streets for that matter of fact. I think they are unique, and every place has those unique qualities, and I think it's about embracing those. I do want to give an example, and like when you ask about time, it's probably going to take a lot. But if we don't start right now, then I don't know how we would get there. But like when people look at Amsterdam, for example. and you kind of compare this bike infrastructure and this bike culture that exists, and they compare American cities, right? Those two comparisons are pretty stark. It's interesting that actually it's an effort of 60 years of very different approaches. So today the US is struggling with increasing traffic fatalities out of any other developed world. And the fact that there is like this dependence on cars, there's carbon emissions, all of that. And then you've got Netherlands, you've got Denmark, all these Scandinavian cities that at a point had actually taken a different route, and it all came from the traffic fatalities that were on a rise. So you had one region that said, okay, no traffic fatalities accepted. We're going to change this. We're going to go back. I mean, again, there was all these oil crises and all these different crises that supported the use of bicycling. But then you had US, which said, oh, you know what? We've got a very strong car lobby that organized itself and said, no, we're going to make better infrastructure for cars, and we're going to make it safe. And we'll put in these rules, and we're going to, try all these different things. So as a result, you see this stark difference between these two places. And I think that it can take up to years, like years and years of time to get to the city that we want to get to, but we have to start somewhere. And, in terms of sidewalks, I don't think that it's not that hard. I mean, we have so much investment in India, whether it's the World Bank supporting certain infrastructure, whether it is cities that are really like the smart cities mission, there is a lot of conversation. But I think the problem is we're asking the wrong questions. Every time there's a public space, there's a street project or a road project, we're asking, how do we move, how many cars can we move in the street versus like how many people do we move, and how do we make sure that there is space for every activity? So I think in terms of time, and you can see that whether it's Pune that has done some really amazing work with their commercial streets where they've widened the sidewalk, they've taken away the parking, and given places for people to sit, or whether you see Bangalore doing some interesting work. So there are cities that are doing this work. I think it's more about just kind of organizing and kind of keep pushing for it. So I do hope that, like if we have very concerted and very efforts with conviction, that in 20 to 30 years, and I know that sounds long, but we have to plan for that level. We have to plan for what vision or what city do we see ourselves, or like how do we see Indian cities being shaped up in 20 years instead of just reacting to what is now. So I don't know if I have the answer. I think that's more like fortune telling, but I do hope that if we organize now, that we can start seeing changes, and maybe it's not going to be large scale overnight, but at least for cities and neighborhoods we can start seeing a better improvement in the infrastructure.
So what do you think needs to improve? I mean, the smart city mission, and there are all these startups coming up, and also NGOs who are investing in footpaths and public spaces, but it's not really been very much visible to the public. It's still not a public space that's very much embraced. So what do you think we can do to actually embrace it?
I do think that, I mean, I think of the example that when I grew up in Gurgaon my parents still live in Gurgaon, which has the, all these multinational companies, and they put in a lot of money there to like beautification with trees, etc. But if you look at just the connections, like just the very basic human scale design, that's missing. And I think that's the challenge with new development now, is that we're forgetting that there is, like, again, to your point, right? Like instead of looking at American cities or looking at, what's happening in the UAE or Dubai or Singapore, we need to come back to recognizing that human scale that makes Indian cities so rich and vibrant needs to be prioritized again. And I think that's where we're lacking that emphasis of not thinking from the perspective of the pedestrian or thinking from the perspective of a child. And I think that's why when we talk about children, we're coming back to like really going at a 95 centimeter height, which is actually very low. Like it's less than a meter, right? It's not even an adult's height. But I think that's where we need to put the emphasis, that as a pedestrian, if I'm walking from my home to get to work, what is my journey like? Where am I facing obstacles? And how can I improve? Like, how can the built environment improve that? So I think that cities that are doing great have actually realized that shift needs to happen. And I think that's why I was referring to the streets in Pune, where they've, really started to look at the human scale and started to change the way those streets work. I don't know if I answer your question completely, but yeah.
So one of the examples I think Tejas, I have seen on this is in 1972. I think the children of Amsterdam had some sort of, they did they kind of revolted against the community leaders over there, and they made sure that they got their streets for them to play over. So, at the end of the day, I think what really needs to change is, I think, our own ownership. If we really want it, I think we would need to do it, honestly. I think, and that's what's most exciting for me, because right now I'm seeing that change happening in our country, which is, I think, can be used to our advantage, really. So the other aspect of doing streets for children is that now the children are also extremely motivated and very, very informed. Don't you think so? Especially the children who are like just in their teens. When I'm talking about that, I'm actually thinking about people like Greta Thunberg, from Sweden, the activist, the green activist, basically. So how do you, for children who are actually so aware and understanding of what's happening and what we're doing to the earth, how do we take care of those needs, wherein you are telling them that, okay, we are also taking care of you and the environment and everything that you need in the. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you seen any examples anywhere globally on that?
On children advocating for change?
No, for children, not children advocating for the change, but basically making their concerns heard. Spaces where their concerns are really heard by people and acted upon. Have you seen such spaces, actually?
Yeah, I think, what you mentioned about Greta Thunberg was, I think this was was it last year when there was this meeting at the UN where, there were a bunch of children and teenagers actually advocating for their concerns. But I think that there are organizations that are doing some really, really interesting work. And I think you're right, like the whole Stop the Child Murder movement that was led by children in Amsterdam is definitely a really interesting example of how that change happened. But there are organizations that are doing that. And I also know on this call, we have some people that have been working with children and kind of raising very children, like from the planning perspective, really helping children understand the planning diaspora from a very young age. But organizations like, and I can think of one, which is, it's an American example, but there's this organization called Growing Up Bolder that works with children and kind of does community engagement with children where they're able to actually make decisions about their built environment. So it's a very interesting, like it's part of the curriculum in the school. They come up with their design ideas, and then that design ideas are presented to the city council or the planning department of the city, which I think is a very interesting way of trying to really match that. And then a lot of times, things that come up is like there were children who asked for something as simple as their drivers. They want to know what the driver that drives the bus, their name is. So they just wanted like a sign that says, this is my name, because they are building that connection to like something as simple as like, oh, this light is broken, and this is where what it makes them feel. So I think that's a really interesting example of community. Again, it's at that community level, it's with children, and it's kind of making sure that there's you're closing the loop between the engagement aspect with kids to then with what's happening in the city. And I think there are other examples too. I know that there's the play standard in Edinburgh, which also does something very similar, where they work with children and kind of bring in their viewpoints and kind of make that connection between the planners and the designers that are actually taking the decision on the streets with children. So I think that there are groups. I can't think of any major advocacy initiatives, but I think the recent one was the climate change and the action that was taken all over the world with children striking for climate. So I think that there's the advocacy, but then there's also the other part is, how do we make sure that we are making sure that the children's voices are represented in in our planning decisions. And I think a lot of times it's about reaching out and making that connection.
So because, I really believe that, once we do that and involve the children or the community that is going to use those spaces for making those spaces, is when the ownership aspect happens, where, and then, those spaces are also taken care of, because that's one of the biggest challenge in India that I personally have faced while working. It's once you make it, it's just very difficult to, keep it the way it is. So uh, that's why I've been just thinking about it, that is there any, public space maybe where children have actually done it? I don't know. So anyway, are there any other questions from anyone in our audiences?
Aditi. Hi, Aditi. Hi, Ankita. This is Poonam. Yeah.
Hi,
I
Poonam.
have a question. Yeah. I have a question for Ankita. I have been attending such webinars wherein there are a lot of issues that we always think about urban level issues with that we always think about cities and not the villages. The villages in India are so much away from basic infrastructure, basic facilities, that the children grow up so raw. I have been abroad in a not in a village but a kind of a town, and then again married and living in some same sort of an environment. But I feel there are so many opportunities that we have to look forward to even revitalize the kind of Indian villages and the towns are looked at. Why always we concentrate upon cities and why not uh, towns or villages?
Yeah,
My
that's
concern is that.
no. I think that's a very fair question, especially in context to India. I think that that's even more relevant. I will say that I think that with a lot of international organizations, and because of this emphasis on just understanding where the global movements are heading, right, like the fact that it's an overly used stat, so I obviously have forgotten that because everyone uses it, which is like the number of people living in cities by 2050 is going to be more than 1/3 of the world population. And I think that, or maybe it's half, I don't even remember anymore, but I think that aspect has obviously made the emphasis move more towards cities, and we can see like a lot of people are actually moving to cities for economic opportunities. Similarly, when we look at like crisis that we're in, right, like if we're looking at the road safety crisis, or sorry, the traffic fatality crisis or the air pollution crisis, they are more relevant and more evident in cities right now than they are in villages. And I absolutely agree with you that there is another part of it of just basic infrastructure that is missing, and there are probably organizations that are doing that. But like again, I feel like we all have a lot of work to do. So depending on which field we want to emphasize and put our energy in is what we're attracted to. But I think that your point is absolutely valid, that there's a lot of work that needs to be done even in just from the basic infrastructure in villages, and there should be more organizations that are focusing on that.
That will
Actually, there are
also
a lot of,
help decentralize the urban areas as well. We are
yes,
not
yes, I
looking
agree
at
with.
that as an opportunity, because we have so many spaces and so many horizontal development happening in the rural sides of the India, but we only concentrate upon the urban areas, and that is where even somewhere at our level also we are more concentrating on again uh, thinking about growing the cities more, and then somewhere we also think about decluttering them. So it's just an idea that this is also a big opportunity you people have.
Yes, I agree with Poonam on this actually. But the thing about it is, Poonam, that I know that the big cities right now, places like Mumbai, Delhi, um, Calcutta, and this thing, Chennai, have a lot of investments going on. But there are also tier 2 and tier 3 cities which are seeing some investments, and we can see that when the smart city, you start seeing smart city documents, and people are equally aware of a lot of things in those cities also. Like I've seen smart city document for Bhubaneswar, Nagpur. I mean, my husband comes from a very small town called Sagar. I've seen the smart city document for Sagar also, and they're extremely ambitious and in what they want to do. So I think I agree with you. Then there is a lot of opportunity, but I think it's, as Ankita said, you just decide where you want to put your energy and then you go for it, and hopefully you will get somewhere in that, and then you'll go to the next step. So, is there any other question from anyone?
I'd just like to interpolate at this point, Aditi, because Poonam has made a very good point. The focus is a lot on urban areas, but not on the peri-urban areas. And the real risk is when villages convert into towns, because we have urban bylaws, but we don't have rural bylaws on things such as street widths and what the distance should be between houses, and what's happened is, especially see that in the outskirts of Delhi, when things go out of shape and there's no control, no planning in the growth, because farmers sell off plots of land, and it's pretty unscrupulous the way the planning and the building happens because the lack of rural bylaws. So that is the real risk. And as more and more new cities, I believe there are, the future cities actually don't exist right now in India. There are scope for another 50 or 100 cities, which will come up from the rural areas. So this is a really very pertinent point, and I think it should be taken into account in the Indian, in the Indian scenario, peri-urban areas.
Definitely, I agree. I mean, and I do see a lot of theses when I teach on this particular subject. I hope that there are a few people who are actually working on this. So, yeah. So, anyone else who has any questions with regards to this topic? Hello? Is there anyone else? Okay. Okay. So,
questions.
Okay, great.
I think somebody mentioned, yes, there was a chat sort of comment, Amina Ricks, and she added that futureplanners.city also engages children in planning and city planning. So that's one to look for in US and Europe. Futureplanners.city. So I'd like to thank. This has probably been one of the most vibrant, and we've been having this event on Friday evenings, but this time we decided to have it on the weekend. And I must say it has been a success, and probably this is the way to go. Have it on a Sunday. It works for me as well. So we'll continue. I think we will probably turn to the UK next in a fortnight from now. So we have diaspora working in placemaking spread all across Australia, Netherlands, the US, and so we'll turn our attention to the UK and then probably on to the Netherlands from there. So do stay tuned in. It's probably happen every alternate Sunday. I'd like to thank Ankita for this brilliant, vibrant presentation. And I think the top takeaway for me was the future of cities will shape the future of children. And we have a 20-year vision. We have a 20-year time frame to work on in India. And let's hope in the course of that, the automotive mission doesn't cancel out the smart cities mission, because there's a huge push to create skills and jobs through automotive manufacturing under the Ministry of Heavy Industries. And the smart cities mission seems to have an almost, especially under Kunal Kumar, to have a mission which runs counter to that, which is livable cities. And how those two are going to be reconciled remains to be seen. And I think especially concerns children, the lives and safety and the fragile sort of the health of children. But I'll end with a note of hope that smart cities wins. So again, thank you so much to both of you. And Aditi, thank you for brilliantly moderating. I can't think of a better person to taking this on from the Placemaking India, found among the founding members. And thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank
you
Vinita.
so much. All this recording will be on YouTube.
Thank you.
By next week, so do look for it if you want to disseminate it. Is there anything else you want to add, Aditi or Ankita?
I would just like to, because this subject is so dear to me right now, when I'm a very jittery parent, like any other parent, and I read all these parenting blogs, and one of the things that strikes, and it's kind of, there is a similarity between what Ankita has been talking and what I've been reading, is that you really in your head have to decide how you want your children to grow, right? What is important to you, and what you want their life to be, and what you want them to hold important to themselves. So I think what Ankita has showed us today is that, if you let children be children on the streets, I think they'll be more confident and more happier. And I think the world will be much more happier if that happens, really. So, hip hip hooray to Ankita and her work. And I'm so excited to see more of her work everywhere in the world.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, Vinita. I will end on one note. I think that the journey is long, but I am really excited to see that, we are, as placemakers, as public space advocates, that we in our own world are starting to organize, because as you said, Vinita, that it's going to be a long battle. And I think the fact is that if we don't start prioritizing children and people, then it's already a lost battle. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm really excited to see the network grow.
Thank you, and I hope you will continue to be part of it and mentor us as we look to you to support us. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right.
Yes, great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.